We welcome everyone back. Again, this is a joint subcommittee hearing of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Energy and Environment Subcommittee. We have been conducting this investigation jointly for 90 days, and we will continue to do so today. Our sole witness on our second panel is the Secretary of Interior, Ken Salazar, who was confirmed as the Secretary of Interior on January 20th, 2009. Prior to that service, he served in the United States Senate, representing the state of Colorado, and before that, he served Colorado as its Attorney General. So we welcome you, Mr. Secretary. It is the policy of this committee to take all testimony under oath, and please be advised that you have the right under the rules of the House to be advised by counsel during your testimony. Do you wish to be represented by counsel? Then would you please rise, raise your right hand to take the oath. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? We thank you. Let the record reflect that the witness replied in the affirmative. You are now under oath. So now we will adjourn and welcome you again, Mr. Secretary. Whenever you feel comfortable, we ask you to please begin your testimony. I think you have to push the button down there. Good.
Okay, got it. Can you hear me now?
If you could move it in just a little bit closer. Yeah, please. Thank you.
Got me? Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman Markey and Chairman Stupak and ranking members Upton and Borges for this opportunity to come and to testify in front of this committee concerning the Deepwater Horizon tragedy and what it has meant for this country and for this government and for the Department of Interior. Let me at the outset say that from April 20th until today, including this morning, we've continued a nonstop and relentless effort to kill the well, to stop the oil from leaking from the well, and to do everything we can to keep the oil from coming on shore. It has been a coordinated effort on the part of, at the direction of President Obama that has included the whole of government and putting every resource that we have, and as the President has directed, we will not rest until we have this problem fully under control. The status of the well as of today, since I thought it might be of interest to the committee, is that it continues under shut-in at a pressure of approximately 6,800 psi. There is an extensive monitoring program which we have directed BP to implement so that we can monitor seeps and any other kinds of changes as the well integrity test continues. The essence of the regime that we are under right now is a 24-hour license that BP is given every 24 hours, and then based on the review of the seismic, acoustic, and sonar and other information that we are getting, then we make a decision about whether they can move forward for another 24 hours. The rationale for that intensive surveillance program is that it is important for us that this well maintain well integrity so that we don't have a catastrophe with the wellbore essentially blowing out and then having all the contents of the reservoir blowing out into the sea. So we continue to spend a great amount of time. In fact, this morning as this hearing was going on, that's what I was working on. I did listen to parts of the testimony, including parts of the testimony from my predecessors, Secretary Kempthorne and Secretaries Norton. Let me at the outset say that this is a tragedy because 11 people have been killed, and there has been an environmental devastation in the Gulf of Mexico, which we are dealing with now and will continue to deal with into the future. There is a tendency to blame everybody who's involved, and from my point of view, there is a shared responsibility, a collective responsibility for how we respond to this issue. I would suggest to all of you that based on your investigations, based on preliminary investigations from BP as well as from preliminary investigations that I have seen, that indicate that there were corners that were cut by BP as it moved forward with respect to this well construction. You are, as a committee, very aware of what some of those are, and you have reported on what some of your findings. I would also say that prior administrations and this administration have not done as much as we could have done relative to making sure that there was safer production in the Outer Continental Shelf. I believe that after drilling some 40,000 wells in the Gulf of Mexico, that all of the nation, including the institutions of government, the Congress, as well as the executive branch and multiple administrations, were lulled into a sense of safety. And what the Deepwater Horizon perhaps drives home more than anything else is that we need to revisit that basic assumption with respect to safety. Let me say that since I came in as Secretary of the Interior, the President and I discussed the reform agenda of the department and made the reform agenda a high priority of mine from day one. Specifically with respect to the former Minerals Management Service, we moved forward with an ethics reform program in the Department of Interior to do away with the sex and drug scandals that we had seen in Lakewood and in other places. And most of the activity that has been uncovered by the Inspector General is activity that has either been referred over to prosecution or appropriate actions have been taken with respect to the firing, suspensions, or other disciplines of those employees who were involved. I will also say on that note that most of the employees at the Minerals Management Service continue to do their work every day. They are working very, very long hours now as we try to bring, for example, the Macondo well under control. We also move forward with the reform agenda by terminating the Royalty in Kinds program, because the Royalty in Kind program had become essentially a magnet for the kind of corruption and ethics lapses that we had seen over the last 8 years. And so the termination of the Royalty in Kind program was a decision that I made early on to try to bring the end to the prior corruption. Thirdly, the Outer Continental Shelf and the plans it had put into place. Many of you will recall that on the last day of the prior administration, there was a new plan that was put forth for the OCS that essentially covered the entire OCS with respect to future development. We changed the OCS plan in what was some very extensive set of hearings, and we were dealing with two different sets of plans, one from 2007 through 2012, and then the new plan that was proposed from 2010-2015. And we narrowed it down so that we're protecting special places in the Arctic, the Chukchi, and the Beaufort Seas, and Bristol Bay, where we canceled 5 leases in that area. We took the Pacific off from drilling activity and proposed that we move forward in a thoughtful way with respect to areas in the Atlantic as well as with respect to the Gulf, where our intention was to stay away at least 125 miles from the shores of Florida. And finally, as you, Mr. Chairman, with your advocacy, we have followed on your direction that we do everything that we can to stand up renewable energy in the offshore, especially in the Atlantic. We see great hope in that possibility. We believe that huge amounts of electricity can be generating from wind, and that is an effort which is well underway. Let me finally, just in terms of how we have moved forward since April 20th and before, we had been working on moving forward with additional safety requirements and additional training for employees. But we've also raised the bar on industry. The 30-day safety report, which I prepared at the direction of the President, set forth a number of recommendations with respect to blowout preventers, cementing, casing, and a whole host of other things that should make drilling more safely. We have moved forward with a safety notice to lessees, which essentially is a recall of the blowout prevention mechanisms and requirements for stronger casing and well design requirements. That notice to lessees has been sent, and we've also sent a notice to lessees with respect to blowout prevention. We are moving forward with the reorganization of what was formerly the Minerals Management Service and have created the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement. That effort is led by the Assistant Secretary of Land and Minerals, Wilma Lewis, who was a former United States Attorney and Inspector General at the Department of the Interior. And the agency itself will be led by Mike Brownwich, who also was an Inspector General for a very long time in the Department of Justice and who has been involved in reorganization matters within the private sector. The reorganization of the new MMS, the new Bureau of Ocean Energy, essentially will have 3 units. One will be an Office of Natural Resource Revenues, and that's to separate the revenue collection function from the other functions related to leasing the resource. A second unit will be one of Bureau an Ocean Energy Management unit, which will essentially make the decisions about where it is that we will be leasing the OCS resources for development. And the third unit will be one that will be focused exclusively on safety and environmental enforcement. Now, this will not come cheap. When one looks at what has happened through the 1990s and through the first decade of this century, the staffing levels at MMS have essentially remained static. We have made requests for additional staff in the last few years. The proposal that we have before the Congress and before OMB contemplates an additional 445 inspectors to help us in carrying out this very important duty for the American people. I will comment just briefly on the moratorium because I know many of the members of this committee are interested in that. It is a moratorium that I have reissued that will stay in place until November 30th, until I am satisfied that we have received appropriate and adequate answers to 3 essential questions. First, whether or not drilling can continue in a safe manner. Second of all, whether or not there is an adequate strategy to deal with blowout containment issues like the one that we're facing. And thirdly, that there is an adequate oil spill response capability that is out there. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I am hopeful that working with the members of this committee and members of the Congress, that the legacy of this crisis will be fourfold. First, that we will move forward to an era of safer production of oil and gas in the Outer Continental Shelf. Secondly, that we will embrace a Gulf Coast restoration program, which Secretary Mabus and the administration are leading in a way that finally restores the Gulf Coast after a century of degradation. Third, that we can embrace a conservation agenda for the 21st century across America. And finally, that it will open up the great possibility to the new energy future that broadens the portfolio of energy which this country has been so dependent on with respect to fossil fuels to now include the power of the sun, the power of the wind, the power of geothermal, and the other parts of the energy portfolio which the President has as part of his comprehensive energy plan.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, very much. We'll turn and recognize the Chairman of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for all your work. This has not been an easy issue for any of us to deal, and especially your position as Secretary of Interior. You've been putting in a lot of hours and long days and working this, and we thank you for your efforts. Let me ask you this question. I asked both Secretary Norton and Secretary Kempthorne this question. The modeling we have for if an oil spill would work are only models that deal with surface spills, not deep water spills. In 2005, an MMS modeling team asked the Secretary that the spill response plans need to be updated to deal with deep water releases. It has never been done. Were you aware when you took over that there was never a modeling program to show what would happen with a deep water spill in the Gulf of Mexico? Were you aware nothing's been done?
The answer to that is no, I was not aware of that.
Then my follow-up question then should we update the model before we go back to drilling? I know we have this moratorium on right now, but shouldn't we have some idea? I mean, maybe we can learn something from Deepwater Horizon, how catastrophic spills will go in the Gulf. Is that enough of a reliance, or should we do modeling before we resume exploration and drilling in the Gulf of Mexico?
Chairman Stupak, I think what we need to do is to make sure that we have adequate plans to respond to the 3 key issues that I just spoke about. And at the end of the day, if you think about the containment program that has been underway since the Macondo well blew out, I think there is ample evidence, which you have seen, which I have reviewed every single day since April 20th in the efforts to close down the well, that tells us that the containment efforts are simply not enough. And so it's an opportunity to really address all of the multitude of shortcomings that have become evident since April 20th.
Well, since our investigation, I've been focusing a lot on the blowout preventer requirements. And as far back as 1997, MMS cut back on testing requirements for the BOPs by reducing required testing frequency from every 7 days to every 14 days because the testing caused downtime on the rigs. But a series of reports conducted between 2001 and 2004 pointed to even bigger problems. Over and over again, these reports indicated that in many cases, blowout preventers would not be able to shear drill pipe in an emergency. If the BOP cannot shear the pipe, then it cannot seal the well to control blowout. The 2001 report concluded that subsea blowout preventers should be equipped with redundant shear rams to increase the chances of success in an emergency. A 2002 report cited, and I quote, a grim picture of the success when using BOPs in an emergency. A 2003 report identified problems with emergency activation systems and a need for remote undersea vehicles to operate all BOP functions in an emergency. The warnings from 2001 through 2004 seem to have anticipated the very problems that have come to pass in the Deepwater Horizon blowout. Mr. Secretary, my understanding is that MMS established new rules for blowout preventers with rulemaking in 2003, but they did not require dual shear rams or other key improvements that the studies indicated were necessary. Is that correct?
That is correct. Those requirements were not required.
On the rule that was made by the Secretary Norton, I asked her about that, and I realize it's not your decision, but in retrospect, do you think that the 2003 federal rule based on these studies should have had the dual rams and shearing capabilities in case of a blowout prevention, in case of a blowout of a well?
You know, my own view, Chairman Stupak, is that there has been a lot learned with respect to these blowout preventers, including the need to make sure that you have the shearing capability. And indeed, some of the blowout preventers that are now being manufactured will require the dual capacity with the shear rams in case that they end up closing in on a place where you have a pipe that they cannot get through.
Well, let me ask you, because your 30-day report on the Deepwater Horizon contained a number of new recommendations for BOPs, including the dual rams shearing, as you indicated. Can you tell me some of the other recommendations and actions that the Department of Interior will be taking to implement safer BOPs?
The recommendations are many, and they're outlined extensively in that 30-day report, as well as in the notice to lessees that we have issued, and additional rules that we will be making. Some of the blowout prevention enhancements that you will be seeing will deal with the shearing capability of rams, but other improvements that have to be, in my mind, put into place as well include assurance that the backup actuation programs do in fact work. And we will be making those requirements, and have made some of those requirements with respect to the 30-day report.
Well, you talked about the need to hire 445 more inspectors. Will this enhance the certification and testing of these blowout preventers and other aspects that you've recommended in your 30-day report?
Absolutely, Chairman Stupak. And let me say that, you know, as much criticism as may be laid in terms of what's happened in the last 90 or 91 days since April 20th, it also has been a great laboratory of learning. There was a conclusion that essentially was a conclusion that most people had, that you could not test the blowout preventers subsea. We now know that that is not the case, and so there will be additional testing requirements that will also be imposed with respect to blowout preventers.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Salazar. Go blue, right?
Go blue.
Michigan Law School, you didn't say that. I don't know if you have had a chance to look at the bill that the full committee reported out last week, 48 to nothing, H.R. 5626, the Blowout Prevention Act. I know that as a number of us were trying to seek comments, I don't know, from the department. I don't know if there was a clearance problem at OMB, but we really didn't get any comments from the administration as it related to the progress of this bill. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, and now that it's been reported out, I wondered if you might want to comment on certain provisions that still may be constructive as we look at this bill before it gets to the House floor.
Congressman Lipton, I just, first of all, agree that this committee put its focus on one of the very key issues that needs to be addressed, and that's blowout preventers. And so I appreciate the work from this committee and the fact that you had that kind of a bipartisan support for that legislation shows that it was a well thought out piece of legislation. We are currently in the process of reviewing that legislation along with a host of other pieces of legislation that are making their way through Congress, and I look forward to working with all of you because I do think that it is a bill that we can work with, and so there may be some modifications or changes that we will request, but we have not yet had the opportunity to dig into it in detail, but we will.
You indicated in your testimony that you're doing in essence, a 24-hour license every single day with BP. What would happen if you actually denied them a 24-hour bill? Would you all take over? What would happen?
Essentially, what would happen is they would have to go back into a containment mode, and that's to essentially minimize the amount of oil that ultimately gets spilled out into the Gulf. And so prior to the time that the shut-in occurred, they were capturing on the average of about 24 to 25,000 barrels of oil a day. So there would be a resumption of some of that oil containment capacity, as well as a program which we required. We ordered BP to develop a program that put in different scenarios with different oil containment capacity, leading up to as much as 80,000 barrels a day of containment capacity. To what would happen as you would transition, though, from a shut-in of the well over to a leak containment program, is that during that interim period, there would be some flow of oil out into the Gulf.
Former Secretary Kempthorne, when he was here earlier this morning, in his testimony, voiced a frustration to a degree that they had sought more money for inspectors, in essence about $2 million more than what Congress provided. You indicated just now that you were looking for about 445 more inspectors. Just wondering if the idea is fostered within the administration that to perhaps go about like a user fee on the industry itself, like we have an escrow account now to pay, I hope, for every dime of, or an escrow account for every dime for the losses, economic losses, et cetera, for folks along the Gulf. Should you not be able to get money from the Appropriations Committee, do you have the authority, would you seek authority to in fact impose a user fee to then provide for these additional inspectors that you're calling for?
We are working closely with OMB, and we'll work closely with the Appropriations Committee relative to the additional resources that are needed and how we fund them. And I know everybody here agrees that we need to find ways of paying for some of these things, and so that's part of the conversation that is taking place. The number that I gave to you in terms of 445 inspectors is what we believe we would need over about a 3-year time frame to be able to do an adequate job of inspecting the oil and gas activities in the Outer Continental Shelf. As I think I heard some of you say this morning, it would be almost, it's almost impossible, frankly, for 60 inspectors to be expected to go out and do the job when we're talking about 4,000 very complicated facilities that they have to inspect in the Gulf of Mexico.
What role do you expect that the President's Oil Spill Commission will play in the decisions about the moratorium? Do you expect that commission to offer advice as it relates to the moratorium, and how would you use it?
You know, we will consult with them relative to whether or not it is time for us to remove our hand from the pause button. But right now, given the dynamic situation in the Gulf of Mexico and the oil and the issues that I outlined earlier, from our point of view, it would be responsible to take our hand off the pause button, as many have suggested. And so we will be developing information in the weeks and months ahead, including information that is developed by the President's Deepwater Commission. If we are to make an adjustment with respect to the moratorium, It will be dependent on the answering to the three fundamental questions which relate to drilling safety, oil containment, and adequacy of oil spill response. And if we were to find a way of doing that before 6 months, then there would be a possibility of doing something different with the moratorium. But for right now, our view is it'll take until about November 30th for us to get that done.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair will recognize himself for a round of questions. Mr. Secretary, in recent days, BP's Kent Wells said that the company is considering an additional technique known as a static kill, or bullheading, now that the well has been capped. This procedure has been described as similar to the top kill, in which mud is introduced at the blowout preventer, but may benefit from the current stop flow and lower than expected pressure at the well. What can you tell us about this bullhead kill? What are the risks and the challenges of the procedure that is now being considered?
The static kill would be a decision essentially to try to kill the well from the top. Some have described it in layman's terms as a sandwich kill, because ultimately everyone has known that ultimately killing this well is going to require the relief well to kill it from the bottom. But in the interim, what BP has been talking about is a possibility of coming in from the top and essentially putting in mud and then cementing the well from the top. Their view is that it can be done easier now that you basically have a shut-in pressure and you don't have a flowing well. But I think Chairman Markey exemplifies a key role that we in the United States have been playing with respect to these kinds of issues. We will not allow BP to move forward with the static kill option if we think that it is going to create greater jeopardy and compromise the integrity of the well. And so there is a science team which is headed by Secretary Chu and includes the directors of all the national labs, as well as Director Marcia McNutt from the U.S. Geological Survey, and they are reviewing these plans and assessing the benefits and risks. And it is on their advice we will allow the science to lead us to the appropriate conclusion before we stop BP or we green light BP on anything.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. If the well is permanently shut in or killed through a static kill, then a definitive determination of flow rates may be precluded. And that would be a success for BP in its continued attempt to obscure the true flow rate of the well. If, however, we do move to a collection strategy, then it would be possible at some point to collect 100% of the hydrocarbons from the well for a period of time. Why is that important? Because BP will be fined $4,300 per barrel for gross negligence. Each 10,000 barrels that's spilled out per day for 80 days or so would be the equivalent of a $3.5 billion fine. 20,000 barrels per day, $7 billion, et cetera, et cetera. If it was 60,000 barrels per day, then the fine would be about $18 billion. So, Mr. Secretary, can you tell us what is the likelihood that we can get as precise a number attached to how much oil has been spilled out in the Gulf of Mexico because of the negligence of BP? We know that BP is trying to lower the liability. They want the maximum amount of ambiguity in terms of what that number is, so that the ultimate settlement will be lower in terms of what BP has to pay to the American taxpayers and to the people in the Gulf of Mexico. So can you just give us some sense of how precise ultimately the goal is for the Obama administration to establish how much oil did go into the Gulf of Mexico?
Chairman Markey, I agree with your conclusion that it's absolutely imperative that we have the flow rate determined in a way that is absolute. We have the best of scientists, again, in the world that have been involved in terms of looking at these flow rates. The current flow rate of the U.S. government, which came about as a result of very extensive scientific work, is between 35 and 60,000. There is additional data that has come in relative to pressure as the well was shut in, and that will provide an additional opportunity in the days ahead to try to come up with a definitive number that will give us the rate of flow at the time of the shut-in. But there are other complicated questions, Chairman Markey, that our scientists will have to look at, including whether or not the amount of flow has changed over time from April 20th until the time of shut-in. But I can assure you that the premise here, that BP be held accountable for everything that it owes to the United States of America relative to penalties and other kinds of assessments against BP, is essentially imperative for us, requires us to make sure that we have accurate flow numbers.
Well, again, I would just say that we know that BP will litigate this issue in terms of how large their fine is, as Exxon did after the Valdez incident. If it takes 10 years, they'll take 10 years. They'll take as much time as they want. I think it's critical for us to establish the most precise number right now, because ultimately the American taxpayers should be fully compensated for what BP did to America's ocean. We thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here and for your service to our country. Let me turn now and recognize the discussion of recognize the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton.
Thank you. I thought you were going to go to Mr. Burgess, but I'm ready to go.
Mr. Burgess pointed towards you.
Oh, he did.
With approvingly.
All right, he has passed the
recognition.
buck.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Burgess, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. The blowout preventer that failed on April the 20th was supposed to be inspected every 2 weeks, and we have been told that this particular blowout preventer was inspected approximately, I believe, 10 days before the accident and passed the test. Is that correct? And if can you share with the committee any of the results of that particular test?
My recollection, Representative Barton, is there was an inspection that did occur in early April of the blowout preventer, and that there were multiple tests that were conducted after that. The inspection would have occurred, and then following that, there were, I think, tests on the blowout preventer April 10th, perhaps April 17th, but other days during that time of April.
So is it correct that this particular blowout preventer that failed on April the 20th, when you had the accident, did pass the inspection earlier?
It did pass the last inspection that was conducted.
When that inspection, or any inspection of these ultra-deep oil rigs are conducted, is there an MMS inspector on site while the test is being conducted?
The answer to that is no. The answer to that is that the tests are conducted by the companies when they are testing the blowout preventer. When the inspections occur, you don't have the capacity, frankly, when the inspector is out there, to get down and see, and conduct the test itself while you're on there. And so you take the information that is provided, and you review that information as an inspector, and that's what you base your findings on. And that's part of the change that I believe needs to be made. It ought not to be a circumstance where essentially an inspector is taking the word of the company relative to the adequacy of a blowout preventer.
So current practice has been a self-administered test using a approved protocol, and then the results of that test are forwarded to the appropriate official at MMS. Is that correct?
As I understand it, Chairman Barton, that is, or Ranking Member Barton.
I like chairman, that's okay.
Ranking Member Barton. My understanding that is how the process works.
Okay. Has your department had a chance to compare the test results of this particular blowout preventer to what happened on the accident day and the inspections that have occurred electronically and visually through the remote monitors of this blowout preventer? In other words, can you indicate what the anomaly was in the accident that caused the blowout preventer not to operate when apparently very soon before that it had operated correctly. You know what, I'm just trying to, we've had 90 days to, as has been pointed out, rightfully so by my friends on the majority, the fail-safe plan was that the blowout preventers would never fail. Well, the blowout preventer did fail. So I would think a key component of the investigation would be compare the test results most recently tested with what actually happened and see what the anomaly is. Has that been done? And if it has, can you share that information with the committee?
Congressman Barton, there are many pieces of evidence that need to be collected, including the blowout preventer. The blowout preventer is essentially the black box that has to be taken up from the floor of the sea. And none of these investigations will be able to be fully completed until that happens. The blowout preventer is now necessary in order to keep the integrity of the well and the well shut.
I understand that.
So when that blowout preventer comes out, there will be a very extensive forensics protocol that will examine all of those issues and determine what went wrong. But it's a critical aspect of the Marine Board investigation. It's a critical aspect that everybody involved in any of the investigations is focused on, and I'm sure your committee will be very interested in those findings as well.
Okay. My last question, I know I've just expired my time. Why was the Jones Act not waived so that some of these international partners could send their equipment to assist in the skimming and the cleanup immediately? Because I know there was a petition to do that. Why was that not granted?
You know, Congressman Barton, I will only say that I have worked with the National Incident Commander, Thad Allen, and our entire group from day one, and the Jones Act has never been in the way of getting any vessel on board to deal with the oil spill response.
So the international community that wanted to send their equipment, that's the fact that they claim they wanted to send it and couldn't because of the Jones Act, that's just not true? They just didn't send it?
It's not true that the Jones Act was any barrier to bring in any of those vessels. That,
then why were they not allowed in? I was told it was because the Jones Act prevented it. If that's not true, why were they not allowed in?
My understanding, and I can get the National Incident Commander's verification on this for you, but that the Jones Act has not been at all a reason for any of these vessels from coming in.
Okay, you didn't answer my last. You've answered the first question. You said the Jones Act was not the reason. What was the reason?
I think, you know, again, it's the National Incident Commander, Thad Allen, that can respond to that. My understanding is that there are multiple reasons, including some of them are the distance that they were and a host of other reasons, but we can get that for you.
But it was, will you state that the reason is not because somebody in the Obama administration said they couldn't? That they were turned down? Can you declaratively state that they were turned down?
Congressman Barton, what I will say this is that no stone has been left unturned in terms of any offer of help that could be used, okay? And that certainly has been the direction that the President has given to us and that the National Incident Commander have been working on from day one.
Okay. I thank the Chair's discretion.
Chairman Waxman, for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Salazar, good to see you. Our committee investigation revealed that BP made a series of risky decisions. When they were drilling the Macondo well, they used a single string of casing that provided only one cement barrier, preventing flow of dangerous gases to the wellhead. They did not use enough centralizers during the cementing process. They failed to fully circulate drilling fluids. They failed to install a key casing lockdown sleeve, and they failed to conduct a cement bond log test to determine if the cement job had failed. Many of these decisions did not conform to industry best practices, but BP went ahead with them anyway. Secretary Salazar, why was BP able to design such a risky well? Can you describe for us the regulations on well design and cementing and why they failed here?
Chairman Waxman, the issues that you have raised with respect to cementing, centralizing drilling fluids, and the rest of the issues that you raised are I know very much a subject of what this committee has looked at. They're very much a subject of what the Marine Board is looking at right now. And we will have some answers with respect to what happened on each of those apparent deficiencies. In terms of the regulations of the department, there are regulations of the department with respect to each of those issues that you raise. Part of the investigation will determine whether or not those regulations were followed or whether they were simply broken. But that's part of what the investigation will look at. And with respect to MMS employees that were involved in the oversight of the regulations and the inspections, I've also asked the Inspector General to take a look at what exactly it was that the MMS employees who were involved in the Deepwater Horizon knew or didn't know. So we're looking at all those issues, and they're all part of the ongoing investigation.
As I understand it, current regulations are performance-based. They essentially tell operators to make sure the design is safe, but require no specifics on how to do so. In the wake of the BP disaster, you've called at least for new regulations regarding the well design and cementing. Can you describe your recommendations and how you intend to implement them?
The regulations are first in terms of this drilling safety and cementing and casing. Chairman Waxman, many of them are spelled out in the 30-day report that we submitted to the President, and those regulations in many ways are then reflected in the legislation which this committee acted on. We are implementing those recommendations through notice to lessees, two of them that have already gone out to cover a number of those recommendations, and are in the process of moving forward with additional regulations, including a new set of rulemaking. In addition to that, the new director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy is hosting a number of public outreach meetings to make determinations as to whether or not additional changes are needed. So it's a dynamic situation, but we're not waiting around until November 30th or January 1st in terms of making changes that need to be made. There are many changes that are being made as we speak.
A number of the recommendations that the commission, I believe it was a commission that you set up, proposed, were embodied in legislation that was passed by this committee called the Blowout Prevention Act of 2010. The legislation would not let BP or any other company take the same shortcuts that were taken on the Macondo well. This legislation requires multiple barriers to prevent gas flows in the well. It requires circulation of the fluids and adequate centralization of the casing. It would mandate the use of a lockdown sleeve. It would require cement bond log testing of key cement jobs. It would also require third-party certification that the well design is safe, making the regulator's job easier. I believe this proposal that came out of our committee will help you in your effort to improve safety of deep water drilling. The requirements in this legislation will go a long way toward preventing blowouts and making sure that regulators have the tools they need to keep well operators from taking dangerous shortcuts. That was the intent of our legislation. It was based on some of the recommendations your people had proposed, and it would not prevent you from revising those regulations and updating them as you saw necessary. But the emphasis, the shift in emphasis would be that there'd be things that would be required to be done before the drilling permit would be agreed to, not just simply that the company was going to say that they'll live up to a performance standard, and then when they failed, then we're looking after the fact as we're now dealing in the BP case. We want to work with you. We want to make sure this never happens again, and we hope that when we pass this legislation and you're finished with your job, we can assure the American people of safety in the drilling of these wells. Yield back my time.
I agree with you very much, Chairman Waxman. And let me say I appreciate the leadership of this committee in focusing in on what was supposed to be the fail-safe. That fail-safe essentially was what lulled the American public, this Congress, multiple executive branches and secretaries and presidents to say that this was safe. And so your focus on that particular issue is one that I very much appreciate. And we are reviewing your bill, and I expect that you know, we'll work things out with your staff relative maybe to some technical issues, but the thrust of it is absolutely correct.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Burgess for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome to our committee. Who is going to be responsible for, when fast forward to when the well is shut in, the blow-up protector will be removed by someone and examined by someone? Can you tell us the process you intend to follow? Who will be charged with removal and who will be charged with the forensics on the blow-up protector? And this is essentially a crime scene, as I understand it. Is that not correct?
Interestingly, Congressman Burgess, we have put together an effort which I've asked Deputy Secretary David Hayes to work with the Department of Justice and the National Incident Commander Thad Allen to assure that the appropriate protocols are followed, because this is Exhibit A, if you will, in a whole host of matters that will unfold before the country in the year ahead. It's a black box, and so we need to make sure that the right protocols are followed and those are being developed.
Well, there's a lot, of course, the determinants as to who's at fault and was there negligence. But then, of course, from our perspective, we wrote a law that you just referenced dealing with preventing the problem from ever happening again, but we don't know what happened that caused the problem that we're dealing with now. So there are, obviously, it needs to proceed on two tracks, but they're both extremely important. One is important from settling criminal issues and liability issues in regards to this accident, and one is important to settling the issues as to how we do proceed in the future with this type of activity. Now,
I agree with you, and if we could, we would be doing the forensics on it right now. The problem and reality is that
You can't move
is
it.
needed to keep the well in control
Sure.
for right now. But as soon as it's over, I can guarantee you the protocol will take over. The United States is in charge. The United States will be in charge of the blowout preventer and will be in charge of the forensics and the evidence.
Will BP be the one that removes it from the ocean floor?
We will, that's going to be will be part of the protocol, and it'll probably be an oversight, with oversight from the United States government, but that will be part of the protocol that we are working on.
Let me just ask you this very briefly. You referenced in an answer to a question, I think, of Mr. Stupak's, or maybe it was Mr. Markey's, that Secretary Chu was having some input into monitoring the condition of the well as it currently exists, as to whether or not the pressures are acceptable, neither too high nor too low. Does I know Dr. Chu is a brilliant man, but does he have experience with well design?
What I will say is that as a Nobel laureate and my extensive work with him the last 90 days, he's probably the most brilliant man on the planet. And having him in a position...
Well, with all respect, the president's a Nobel laureate, but I don't know that he would be the best person for that job.
But if I may, what Secretary Chu has done with my assistance and my working with him is we've assembled the best team. You would be proud of them, Congressman, of scientists from around the country, from the Federal Department of Energy Labs, Sandia Labs, Tom Hunter, Marcia McNutt from the United States Geological Survey. And they have collective petroleum.
But they don't design wells, with all due respect. All I'm concerned about here is you referenced the fact that BP may want to do something different from what the Department of Interior wants. At some point, if there's a divergence of opinion, does BP lose any of their liability if the department wants them to go in a direction that they're uncomfortable in going, or if they said, we really just want to go ahead and shut this thing in with the whatever you called it, the bullhammer approach now? Who ultimately gets to make those decisions, and then what release of liability is there for the party of the first part, BP, if the wrong decision is made?
The United States is in charge. The United States, working through the National Incident Commander, will give the approvals and authority on the way forward. Those decisions, Representative Burgess, will be guided by the best of what the science community tells us, and we have the best of the science world involved in this issue.
I wish we could all be so sure. We don't even know about the presence of a thief zone down there or the ultimate potential for collapse of the wellhead. I mean, that has been a concern since it was raised in this committee some 6 weeks ago. So I wish I could share your certitude about that. I've got a number of questions related to the moratorium. I hope we will have the opportunity to submit questions in writing because I think this is important. But have you done a risk analysis on the likelihood of other wells failing in the Gulf?
The moratorium decision, which we issued in a 20-plus page document, laid out the factors related to my decision. My decision essentially was based around 3 key factors, which there is tremendous evidence in the record to support and tremendous evidence which I know this committee has seen unfold before its very eyes. And those issues relate to drilling safety, oil containment, and oil spill response. Today, if there was another oil spill response requirement in the Gulf of Mexico or somewhere else, we would not have the capacity to respond to it because all of the resources essentially are focused in on dealing with the blowout at the Macondo well.
Before I'm gavelled down, would you supply that risk analysis for the committee for the record?
We will supply you a copy of my decision, which essentially includes reference to a very extensive record.
Actually, the papers supporting the decision would be what the committee would benefit from.
We will work with your staff to figure out exactly what it is that you want, but we do the decision that was made last week and communicated last week was a very well thought out decision.
But based upon some set of facts, and if the set of facts could be provided to the committee, that's what we would appreciate.
Mr. Dingell for questions, please.
Thank you. Ms. Secretary, pleasure to see you before the committee. Thank you for being here. Ms. Secretary, I'm troubled. Where in the statute does NEPA allow for categorical exclusions? What is the citation in the statute which permits that?
Congressman Dingell, I think you get to the broader question with respect to the environmental review of oil and gas leasing in the Outer Continental Shelf.
No, Ms. Secretary, this is a very specific question. I say this with great affection and respect. But NEPA says that every single action which has a significant impact upon the human environment shall be accompanied by an environmental impact statement. Nowhere in that statute, and by the way, Scoop Jackson and I wrote this in the late 60s and early 70s, nowhere in the statute is there authority given for a categorical exclusion. Is it the interpretation of your agency that there is a categorical exclusion in this, or is it the interpretation of the Council on Environmental Quality that such be so?
It's founded in law, and it has to do with this. Chairman Dingell, if you will, with all due respect, there was an environmental impact statement that was conducted with respect to the 2007-2012 plan. There was another environmental impact statement with respect to this.
Here was the way it worked, Ms. Secretary, and let's refresh our collective recollections. There was essentially a generic environmental impact statement issued for the entire block in which the lease existed as opposed to the specific lease. And I'm trying to figure out what transpired here. I've heard talk that there is some kind of a device for a categorical exclusion. I want to make sure that your department is not misinterpreting the statute, or that the statute has not been improperly amended at a time since Scoop Jackson and I got it into law.
Let me say that the fix here is what the President and I have proposed to the Congress, and that is there is a requirement in the law under OXA that an exploration plan be approved within 30 days of its submission. And so what we have asked is that that time frame be extended from 30 days to 90 days in order to be able to do the appropriate environmental review.
Well,
so that's one of the areas that we hope to work with the Congress on to make sure that the way in which categorical exclusions have been used in the past is not the way
I-
they are used in the future.
I think, Ms. Secretary, in the interest of time, I would like to submit this and ask that you respond for the purpose of the record. Have there been any categorical exclusions, and if so, how many, granted where oil and gas companies got licenses to drill? If so, how many? You will all permit that to be inserted into the record. And so would you submit that for us, please? Now, Ms. Secretary, tell us about this cement bond log. No such test was performed on the Macondo well. Is that correct?
Chairman Dingell, the answers to those questions are still a part of the
Okay.
investigation. Your committee has found that apparently
Would you
they were not.
submit that, please, Mr. Secretary, for the record?
But Chairman Dingell, if
Now, but I would like you to tell me if Interior does not insist that such a test is performed, then how is the department to know that that is, rather that the law has been complied with and that in fact the lease is being safely and properly executed by the oil company?
Chairman Dingell, we have conducted and are conducting a comprehensive review of the whole regulatory regime relative to
Ms.
drilling
Secretary,
in the
with
Continental
respect
Shelf.
and affection again, I will submit this for the record and ask that you respond. Now, Mr. Secretary, it's my understanding that leasees are required to submit a blowout scenario. In 2003, all leases in the Gulf were exempted from this requirement unless they fell into 4 specific categories. In 2006, this was expanded to 5. Is this correct?
It is correct that that's the way it was, as I understand it,
Okay.
Chairman Dingell, but it is also correct that those are some of the changes that we have already made as we have moved forward with the 30-day
I don't want you to
report to the
feel
President of the
uncomfortable about this,
implementation of the
Mr.
regulation.
Secretary. I just want to gather the facts. Now, did the Macondo well require a blowout scenario, or was it exempted from a blowout scenario?
The Macondo well had a requirement with respect to a blowout preventer under the regulations.
Again, I'd like to submit that in a written inquiry. I thank you, Ms. Secretary. I ask, Mr. Chairman, that the record remain open for both my letter and the response of the Secretary, if you please.
As Chairman Dingell knows and other members know, this record would stay open for 10 days for additional questions, so we will make sure that that's done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Secretary. It's a pleasure to have you before the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Mr. Shimkus for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too would like to submit for the record for you, Mr. Secretary, if you would supply the committee and staff with all risk analysis of another blowout that was used in determining the first moratorium and then obviously the second. There's got to be some risk analysis that was conducted, and we would like for you to submit that for the record. First of all, I want to thank you for being here, and I appreciate your candor and say, hey, there's enough blame to go around for all of us. I think the deep sea modeling issue is just another one that a lot of us let slip by, things that we could have done. And so I think it's important that we look at the problem, try to resolve the problem, make BP pay, and move forward. This is historical in my 14 years, having a sitting secretary and 2 previous secretaries in one day, and as I noted earlier, I've not seen that ever done. I've never seen a Secretary of Energy brought before, and then the previous Secretaries of Energy brought on the same day. I've never, it is what it is. So we welcome you here. You mentioned, first of all, for electricity generation in this country, are we independent? Are we as a nation, for the most part, independent on our energy needs for electricity generation? I can help you. I know you're not in the energy. The answer is yes. So when we talk about energy needs of this country, I like to break it up into electricity generation and liquid fuels for transportation needs and the like. You made a comment in your opening statement about the huge amounts of energy that'll be able to be recovered by wind in the Atlantic coast. Can you define huge for me? And this has got to be electricity generation because we don't make transportation fuel out of wind. I'm just trying to figure out what huge is.
The formal evaluation, as I recall, from the National Renewable Energy Lab is that there is about 1,000 megawatts of power available. Now, there is a...
But that's intermittent, right? It's not, you can't totally rely upon that for baseload generation.
Let me, Congressman, answer your question. There is a connect between how we use electricity and how we consume oil. And this president has been working for a long time.
Okay, reclaiming my time, I really am short, and I want to stay true to the 5 minutes. So let me just say that.
Chairman, I would just like to make my point. Let me answer my question.
Would you let him answer, and then we'll...
No,
do
I've got like
extra
3 more
minutes?
questions I need to go to, so I get the point. My point is there's
Okay.
electricity and liquid fuel. It is
Here,
my
I will
time.
answer my question in 2 words. Electricity and transportation are tied together.
Maybe in the new world, but it isn't today. I'll tell you what real power is. 1,600 megawatts by a coal-fired power plant being built. That's the equivalent of 624 wind generators. The 624 wind generators would take 30,000 acres of land to in place. So we just got to keep this. There's not huge. Huge is nuclear. Huge is coal. Renewable is helpful. But to sell the story that it is the salvation of our energy needs is really doing a great disservice to this country. Let me move on to the moratorium. If there's 33 rigs idle right now, if I said that that's 45,000 jobs and equivalent jobs, would that be close?
Yeah, there have been different numbers that I have seen from
30,000?
experts. There are thousands of jobs.
If I said a loss of $330 million in payroll, would that be close?
I haven't seen the number in dollars.
$2 billion in royalties to the federal treasury is lost. Would that be close?
There's no doubt the moratorium has an economic impact.
Okay, the last question, and I do it respectful too, but this moratorium's killing me, and it's killing jobs in a place that needs jobs. When you put your hand on the pause button, is business planning and decision-making pausing? I'll give you an example. In my opening statement, I talked about a release yesterday. First rig sails away over drilling ban. Diamond Offshore announced Friday that its Ocean Endeavor drilling rig will leave the Gulf of Mexico and move to Egyptian waters immediately, making it the first to abandon the United States in the wake of BP oil spill and a ban on deep water drilling. That is in the time when we need jobs in the economy and energy's report. We pray that you have some concern about the jobs of this country and of Louisiana. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Congressman, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just respond very briefly in
Yes.
two sentences. First, we are aware of the economic impacts of the moratorium. We also believe that it would be irresponsible to take our hand off the pause button given the current circumstance. Second of all, with respect to electricity, we do believe that the future of it is huge, and it's going to be part of the future energy portfolio of the United States. So I respectfully disagree with you, Congressman.
Mr. Green for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. And I'm going to ask my staff, I talked with you earlier about a letter that Congressman Kevin Brady and I sent on June 24th that a number of our colleagues signed on to, outlining hopefully an interim solution on to lift the Deepwater drilling ban on a small scale. And like my colleagues, I represent a very urban district in Houston. It has refineries, chemical plants. We do everything energy, including I have constituents who work offshore, and historically families who've worked offshore. So the moratorium is a very big issue. The letter we're asking about is that several of my colleagues was propose allowing low-risk development and appraisal wells to be drilled while Department of Interior continues the assessment on deepwater exploratory wells. These type of wells offer the reassurance of smaller, minimal risk because of the delineation and sidetrack drilling that accompanies these wells merely to serve to define the parameters of the known reservoir. If your department agreed to this modification, hopefully it's under consideration for almost the last month, it would address the administration's call for safe and secure drilling and estimate about 75% of those jobs you heard earlier that would be lost under the moratorium if we go forward with a full 6 months. And it would also help prevent future energy supply shortages in 2011 and 12 because these wells don't come in immediately, particularly deep water. It takes a long effort to get there. Now their new moratorium focuses on drilling configurations and technology rather than drilling depth. And since the whole basis of our proposal stems from the specific drilling configurations, and assuming we quickly get the blowout preventer and rig equipment inspected by Interior and third-party certifier, would that prevent you from exempting these wells from the moratorium? And again, these are not actually production wells. These are actually just delineating the reservoir and are much less riskier than the horizon. So I know you have a copy of the letter now, and we sent it, like I said, on June the 24th. But I appreciate you seriously in the Interior seeing if we can moderate that 6 month to where we can get 75% of these folks actually back working. And that way we wouldn't have these rigs sailing off to somewhere else. And I just appreciate if you just say you'll consider it. That's fine with me, and we'll be back in touch because you've been real great with your time with a lot of us over the last 2 months trying to work with you in Interior.
If I may, Congressman, the key issues that we're looking at that we need to have some satisfaction with are drilling safety, blowout containment, and oil spill response. And Michael Bromwich, the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy, has already publicized a schedule of meetings that he's going to have, especially in the Gulf Coast states, developing additional information. And it may be that the moratorium could be adjusted based on zones of risk. We already have said that it is okay to move forward with drilling in the shallow waters. Okay, we have said that there may be a possibility of doing something that distinguishes between wells that are being drilled off production platforms versus wells that are being drilled into exploration wells where we don't know anything at all about those formations or insufficient information. So that's part of the analysis that we currently have underway, and we would be and we'll keep you informed as we move forward with that analysis.
And that's what our letter asked for, those less riskier wells, that we could get those folks back to work and delineate the reservoirs. Again, the taxpayers would benefit, obviously my constituents and people who work there. My second question is, and you mentioned shallow well drilling. I appreciate it. The first production well was actually, permit was given last week. And, you know, my concern, there's been a de facto moratorium on shallow well drilling. There have been reworking and things like that, permits given on shallow well drilling. But like I said, the first actual production well was issued last week. And from what I understand from today's Wall Street Journal, that company actually started drilling Sunday because there was such a demand in shallow water. We've also sent an earlier letter to you at the end of May from Congressman Bustani and I that we appreciate the lifting of the shallow water. But like I said, the first new well permit was issued last week. In fact, I was told yesterday that several shallow water producers met with Mr. Bronwich's staff on yesterday, and they're close to an agreement on some of the guidance in NTL 06, because that's some of the concern. We're having field offices don't know what NTL 06, and they're not issuing those permits. And as soon as possible, if we get the rules there, because these are shallow water wells, all the equipment is up on top. If you have a question about the blowout preventer, it's on dry. It's not 5,000 feet below sea level. And there are a great deal of natural gas that's produced and jobs created from those shallow water wells. So I appreciate, hopefully, that one permit that was issued last week for production, we'll see more issued in the next few days. So that'll show that there's not a de facto moratorium on shallow well drilling. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Griffith, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am listening intently to the testimony, and it's obvious that we all crave certainty in our lives, and therefore we want to measure everything. I think that in my particular case, I'm not so much interested in the technical aspects of the wellhead or what have you, but I do know that the capping of the well was low tech. I do know that this was not a difficult concept of putting a cap on top of where the oil was coming out of, but I do know that it took a good long while. And I do know that we will fool ourselves into some degree of confidence that we are doing the job when we measure and continue to measure, and I know we will generate a huge booklet of regulations. But I remind all of us that if I step on the bathroom scales and it looks at 200 pounds, I get off of that bathroom scale and I put a cotton ball on, the needle doesn't move. Whatever we're measuring has a finite amount of confidence to it. So what I'm concerned about is that we're going to have a blowout again. As diligent as we are today, and as many of the things that we'd like to measure, but we do know that the thermodynamics and the external variables, the internal variables, almost make deep water drilling a biologic system. And we know that a human can die with a normal blood work and a normal EKG and a normal MRI and a normal CT scan. So we're going to have this event once again in front of us, regardless of our intentions. And so my concern is from the time that well blew out to the time we put a cork in the bottle, so to speak, okay, what happened? And my other question is this: should that have happened when your position was empty? Should that have happened in between administrations or in between Secretary of the Interior? Who takes charge? Who takes charge? It reminds me of the story of the nurse that goes down to the nurse's station and says, "Mr. Jones is blue." The nurse takes the chart out and says, "What room is he in?" And she duly charts it. Then says, "What do you think we should do?" "Well, let's call his doctor. It looks like he might need some oxygen. We can't give it to him without an order." His doctor's not on call. Do you think it's his heart or is his lung doctor we should call? Well, by the time we get there, well, he's not blue anymore. He's got a tag on his toe and he's on the way downstairs. Okay. So what we saw here was a Coast Guard, an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. We saw mayors and governors all weighing in, and it appeared that there was no central control immediately of the situation. So after we create the documents, and this happens again, who can you point to, and not you, but generic you, says this is the guy that takes care of the oil well problem. This is the guy that takes care of the earthquake problem. This is the guy that takes care of the tsunami problem. This is the guy that takes care of the hurricane problem, because we've done this before in America, whether it be Katrina, the Columbia accident, or what have you. We're having trouble going from tremendous amounts of knowledge to executing it in the field. And I think that should be part of our response and solution. I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, Congressman Griffith, Admiral Thad Allen was appointed as the National Incident Commander. All of the United States government goes through him as he coordinates the overall response. Secretary Chu and I have been focused in two areas. One is on the source control, on the kill of the well, And I have been focused as well in terms of protecting the 44 wildlife refuges and national parks and the ecological resources of the Gulf Coast. Secretary Napolitano obviously overseeing the Coast Guard and being under the presidential directives, the person overall in charge of the oil spill response. So there's a whole, the federal government from day one.
Well, my question is simply this: can we make that more efficient? Could we say this is a catastrophe and we're on it from day 1 or 2 or 3? In other words, can we reduce that timeline? Because capping that well was probably not a novel light bulb going on in some engineer's brain. It probably, had they put their...
Gentleman's time is...
we may have been able to have done it quicker.
If you can answer, Mr. Secretary.
I will say that I think from day one, I sent my deputy without overnight clothes on April 21st to New Orleans, along with Kendra Barkoff, who is here to begin to monitor the situation, and quickly we're in communication with Secretary Napolitano and the White House and everybody else. We've been on it since day one. I do believe, Congressman Griffith, that when one looks back, that as one should, I think in any post-mortem, there will be an opportunity to see how things might have been improved. That's just the nature of how these things go. We are dealing with what is an unprecedented and the largest oil spill response in the history of this country. And the resources that have been spent have been enormous, and the mobilization of the United States government has been at the direction of the President relentless, and with his specific direction that we will not rest until we get this problem solved.
Well, I appreciate you and your staff. I don't like the moratorium a bit, but
Okay,
I
Mr.
can't
Griffith,
like
your
everything.
time is up, please.
Thank you.
Let's go next questioner. Ms. Capps for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us. During the previous testimony today by your predecessors, strong comparisons were made between the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and Hurricane Katrina. It was striking to me that what was not mentioned was one very striking difference. The hurricane, which occurred 5 years ago, was watched by the entire country as it approached land and wreaked havoc, for 2 full days, and then it was gone. But with the exception of the initial deadly explosion, the extent of the oil spill was unknown. It occurred a mile below the surface of this Gulf, and the perpetrator of the blowout, BP, withheld so much information, videos and reports for days and weeks. We in the government, and more importantly, the American people, were lied to. Precious response time was wasted, let alone any requirement to have response equipment already in place and ready to go on day 1. Now it's day 90, and you and your team have been in full response mode, but you've also been learning a great deal. And I want to let you talk, or ask you to talk, please, and respond for a minute or so, or fairly briefly. I want to follow it up with another similar kind of question to look where we've come from, but also on your watch, where we should go from here.
Well, it seems to me, and I appreciate the question, Congressman Capps, I think when you look at it back from a global perspective, that we are looking at what the President has been pushing, and many of you have been supportive, which is a comprehensive energy program for this nation. And in that comprehensive energy, many of you are supportive of the renewable part of the portfolio. Some of you are more supportive of the oil and gas part of the portfolio. But we all recognize, and the President recognizes, that oil and gas will be part of that portfolio during this transition time. The question then for all of us as the United States becomes, how can we make sure that oil and gas, as it is produced, is being produced in a way that is safe and protects the environment? And to me, Congresswoman Capps, the central questions come down to these 3. First, can we assure the American public that drilling can continue in a safe way? Your blowout prevention bill, which you passed, is part of that answer. Secondly, if you do have a blowout, what are the oil containment programs in place to be able to deal with the blowout? They obviously were not in place to deal with this issue that now is in its 90th day. And then thirdly, what are the adequate oil spill response capacities that are needed to be able to deal with an oil spill response if one should ever occur again? When we have answers to those questions, it seems to me then we're able to move forward.
Thank you. I have to say, in your position as Secretary, from my perspective as a coastal representative, I very much appreciate your decision to shelve the Bush plan to open up much of the California coast to oil and gas leasing. It was referenced today already that the development of the previous administration's offshore energy program plan appeared to be driven more by energy companies than by public input or the best available science. In contrast to this kind of closed-door process employed by this previous administration, it appears to me that your decisions are being informed by public input and incorporating the best available science. I salute the listening sessions that you held right as soon as you were sworn into office, long before this event ever occurred, and I was fortunate to be part of one of them. And I noticed that Director Brownrich announced yesterday that there will be additional public hearings coming up in the next few months to inform the leasing decisions that you will then be making, this accompanied with some of the science. So this is what I'd like you to spend the rest of the time on, if you would. How do you intend to use this decision, this gathering of information and in your decision-making process?
Congresswoman Capps, we will use the information that we collect from the Bromwich set of hearings to move forward in consideration of the three central questions that I outlined previously, all of which relate to the moratorium and to the ultimate goal here, which is to develop a safe and protective oil and gas production program for the Outer Continental Shelf. You are correct that when I took office on January the 21st, I had in front of me a new 5-year plan that was to go into effect in 60 days that essentially opened up all of the waters of the United States. I decided 60 days was insufficient for public comment and extended it to 180 days and had the hearings which you participated in California, Alaska, and other places. And it is our view, it is the President's strong view that the decisions are best made when they are transparent and when we are maximizing public input.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Latta for questions, please. 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your time here. I read with interest in your conclusion, which you've talked about a little bit already, but I'd like to also just read. It says, much of my time as Secretary of the Interior has been spent working to reform old practices of the MMS and advance the President's vision of a new energy future that will help us to move away from spending hundreds of billions of dollars each year on imported oil. A balanced program of safe and environmentally responsible offshore energy development is a necessary part of the future. Our efforts to develop a robust OCS renewable energy program are a major part of the effort to find that balance and help us move our nation toward a clean energy future. Then you also go on to state that, for now we have to look at conventional oil and gas. It's interesting that we're here today because I'm not sure you probably did see the front page of the Wall Street Journal today. China tops U.S. in energy. And I'd just like to read just a little bit from this. China has passed the U.S. to become the world's biggest energy consumer, according to the new data from the International Energy Agency, a milestone that reflects both China's decades-long burst of economic growth and its rapidly expanding clout as an industrial giant. China's ascent marks a new age, it says here, in the history of energy. Then it goes on that I think it's also interesting, a little bit farther in the article, it says, China overtook it, meaning the United States, since it says here a little earlier that the United States was the largest energy user since the early 1900s in the world. China overtook it at breakneck pace. China's total energy consumption was just half that of the U.S. 10 years ago. But in many of those years since, China saw annual double-digit growth rates. It had been expected to pass the U.S. about 5 years from now, but took that top position today. The reason I read that is because I represent the largest manufacturing district in the state of Ohio, and I also represent the largest ag district in the state of Ohio. My district, if we're going to survive, and according to national manufacturers, 2 years ago I represented the 9th largest manufacturing district in the nation. And because of where we are with the economy, we're 20th now. But, my main concern is what Mr. Shimkus brought up. We have to have baseload capacity in this country, and I'm all for an all-of-the-above strategy, and that all-above strategy has always been we need nuclear, gas, oil, clean coal, wind, solar, ethanol, biodiesel, hydrogen, and right down the line. But for the factories in my district to operate, we have got to have power that turns on immediately, or we're not going to have people working. And the biggest problem in our area, we just talk about one thing, jobs, jobs, jobs. And when folks look around and they ask me, how come the jobs are leaving the United States? Well, now I'm looking at this article, and I can point one more thing that's killing us is that, the energy needs in this country are being shipped someplace else, which means their manufacturing's topping ours. The Chinese want to be, top us in manufacturing here in 10 years, and if they're able to do in energy, they might do to us in manufacturing. This is getting scary. And it's kind of odd, right on top of this, there's another story in the journal today. It says, personal journal, how to tame your nightmares. Well, this is my nightmare right here. And, I'm really concerned that as the administration goes forward and that we get 30% of our U.S. oil comes from the Gulf, that, as you said in your statement on page 10 here, that, that you will continue to look at this conventional oil and gas playing a significant role in our economy and not selling it short, because we've got to have it to survive as a manufacturing country. And I'll leave it the rest of the time for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Lada. As I have said in previous testimony, the President from day one has said we need to have a comprehensive energy plan. And our view is part of the reason the United States will fall into second place is if we are not able to get a comprehensive energy plan adopted for the United States of America. And hopefully there is still time in this Congress to be able to do that. Because once the right signals are sent to the market, essentially what you are going to have is a different kind of headline than the one that you were showing me from the Wall Street Journal. And that is that we as the United States are not playing for second place. We're playing for first place, as the President has said. But in order to do that, we need to have the long-range policies in place to bring up, as many of you support nuclear, as many of you support clean coal, as many of you support wind and solar and geothermal. But we need to have a framework that isn't the start and stop of energy policy, which we in this country have now had for the last 30 years.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Latta. Mr. Melancon, questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Secretary Salazar, I'd like to kind of follow up on something that Mr. Dingell was inquiring about. It's my understanding that there is a requirement of a 30-day EIS completion for these Deepwater wells, and if it can't be completed in 30 days, then in fact they can waive, the department, MMS can waive that requirement. Is that?
The issue on the categorical exclusions is that you cannot do, frankly, an environmental impact statement in the 30 days. And so what has happened is that categorical exclusions have been given in the past under Republican and Democratic administrations with respect to exploration plans, as happened here in the McConnell.
Do you have, or does your staff know when that categorical exemption was put into effect, either by law or was it put into effect by rule within the department?
I can get that information for you, Congressman Melancon. I don't have that at the top of my head right now.
Is this same waiver applicable in all of the Gulf Coast states, or is it only applicable in certain states?
My understanding, Congressman, is that there have been several hundred of them that actually have been given, and it would not be done on a jurisdictional basis off any one of the states. And so the reality is that the categorical exclusions are driven in large part because under the current law relating to OXLA, there's a 30-day requirement to approve an expiration plan once it is filed with the department. And so that is not sufficient time to do the right kind of environmental review, and it is the reason why in the President's submission of a legislative package to Congress, he said that requirement of the law should be changed to 90 days.
If you would, and if you would just ask, this can be responded to. The reason I asked that question is I've been told, and I don't know that this is valid or not, that Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, the 30-day requirement with the waiver, if it can't be done in 30 days, was applicable. But the other two Gulf states, they had to do the EIS regardless. Don't know that for a fact, but if your department could
We will check on that and get back to you on it.
We've had, as you know, and you and I have gone back and forth, and I appreciate your efforts to stay in contact with me. You've been better at me at returning calls back to you. But the moratorium is more concern, and I guess the concern I've got is, one is the commission that was set up. They have any charge whatsoever about making recommendations as to whether the administration stay with the moratorium, or if they have some findings, or are they charged with looking for findings to bring back to the administration and to you to say this moratorium maybe isn't good, the economic hardship or impact would be worse than trying to find some method or way of doing a rolling inspections, as we've talked about in the past.
Congressman, the President's Deepwater Horizon Commission has as its mission to get to the bottom of the story as to what happened with respect to the blowout at the Macondo well and the Deepwater Horizon. And they will undertake that effort as they have already started. We will be informed by their proceedings and information as they develop and recommendations that they make. So we will be in contact with them as we develop our own information and move forward with our process on addressing the issue of the moratorium.
Can you give me, if it's possible, what was the thought processing? I mean, was it just strictly the concern with another blowout as opposed to a moratorium? Or was there any discussions about finding something, as I've described, that would work for inspections and safety that was somewhere between drill, baby, drill, and shutting it completely down? Was there any discussions there, or did it just go straight to, we've got to shut this down and try and find out, make sure we don't have another blowout, and let's not worry about the economy? What transpired in those conversations, do you recall?
Congressman, those issues were in fact looked at and considered, and they are part of the record and part of our decision on the moratorium. I will say this, that as I am here in front of this committee today, we are still in a very dynamic and a very dangerous situation. We are not out of the woods, even though this well has been temporarily shut in, because until we get to the ultimate kill of the well, the situation is still a very dangerous one. And it is our view, and I have worked on this from April 20th forward, that until we have the answers to the fundamental questions that I outlined to the committee earlier on, that it would be imprudent for us and irresponsible to move forward and lift the moratorium. Now, as information develops, as we move forward with our review, and as Director Bromwich holds his hearings, two of which I think are scheduled for Louisiana, that we will have an additional set of information that might allow us to adjust the moratorium at some point. But right now, looking at the time frame, our view is that November 30th is the reasonable time frame when we can expect to be able to make some decisions on the moratorium.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Melanson. Mr. Shadegg for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I want to commend you, as did my colleague, Mr. Shimkus. I listened very carefully to your opening statement, and it's not often that in this town anybody comes forward and acknowledges, look, we could have done things better. In your opening statement, you said that past administrations and this administration had not done as much as they could have done to ensure the safety of this industry or to ensure the safety and ecological protection necessary for this kind of activity, and I appreciate the candor of that statement. You also went on to say, and I appreciated it, that with 40 years of drilling history and there being no incidents, I believe your words were this administration and prior administrations had been lulled into a sense of complacency, and I think that is a fair assessment. I don't know how much of this hearing you've been able to watch, but in the appearance of your two predecessors during the early hours of this hearing, that was not the kind of testimony that was going on. Rather, there was a blame game being played very aggressively by some members of the committee, trying to assign blame and trying to point fingers. I don't really think that solves the problem. I think it's more important to look at what went wrong, but more important to live our lives looking forward at what we can do correctly in the future. In that regard, I believe the report that you received on May 27th it contained language to the effect that the industry had had over 50,000 wells in the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf, of which more than 2,000 were in waters 1,000 feet deep or more, 700 were in waters 5,000 feet deep, that we had been using subsea below preventers since the mid-1960s, and that the only major prior event from offshore drilling had been 41 years ago, and that in fact had been from in the Santa Barbara Channel, and had been from a shallow water platform where the blowout preventer was on the surface. I assume that's what you were referring to when you were talking about the history of this industry led us to be using the procedures we were using prior to this incident. Is that correct?
Congressman, what I would say is that 41 years of a relatively good record essentially led the United States Congress and many administrations to essentially assume that there was safety with respect to this kind of drilling.
Mr. Kempthorne said just about that. And he also noted that we'd never do it again because we've learned from this incident.
But the fact is that that assumption was made, and we do have an ongoing disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think from our point of view, it would be imprudent for us to simply move on as if nothing had happened.
I couldn't agree.
At the end of the day, where you were is where the President and I have been from day one on this. We have a problem, and we have to fix it, and we have to fix it right.
I couldn't agree more. My time's short, so I want to get to all these questions. Mr. Waxman, in his questioning, talked about several issues. He mentioned that there are regulations on, you mentioned in response to his question, that there are regulations on casing and cementing and mud and all of those issues, and that a part of your study now is to find out, were those regulations followed or were they broken? And that's a part of the forensic activity. Wouldn't you agree that it would be prudent before this Congress enacts permanent legislation, at least legislation specifying details in that nature, as opposed to granting you regulatory authority, that we get the answers to those questions before we enact legislation?
You know, I think we have already learned a great deal from this ongoing disaster in the Gulf that provides a basis for which to act. Now, that does not mean that as we go forward and the President's Deepwater Horizon.
But we don't, by your own testimony, we don't know the answer to those details, correct? We don't know exactly what went wrong here. You said earlier we can't get to those things because we're too busy trying to cap the well, stop the flow. We haven't been able to do the forensics yet, correct?
We know a lot. We don't know everything yet.
Great. You said in response to Mr. Shimkus' question that huge was 1,000 megawatts. Then he cut you off. Did you really mean huge means 1,000 megawatts, or is that huge compared to what we thought wind could do prior to this?
It was 1,000 gigawatts off.
Oh, you said megawatts. So that's quite a bit of difference. Okay.
If I said that, I apologize. I meant to say the National Renewable Energy Lab's calculation of the potential for offshore wind is at about 1,000 megawatts, but the states along the Atlantic.
I don't want to be rude. I want to get into this last question, and my time is extremely short. Gigawatts is very different than megawatts. You just misspoke, and it just stunned some of us back here. You are aware of the email that was sent by the 8 scientists who disagreed with your characterization of their report and were quite angry that it had been changed after they signed off on it and before they submitted it. The original report said that the moratorium should last for a sufficient, and I'm quoting here, quote, for a sufficient length of time to perform additional, and then they talk about blowout, preventer testing, pressure testing, and water barrier testing. It then is changed by your department to say a 6-month period. Is it routine for the department to change reports after the fact? And I note that today, and I'm going to run out of time here, I note that today you
You're out of
said,
time.
I'm out of time.
Go
I
ahead,
note that
ask your
today that you said that the current moratorium will remain in effect until November 30th or until those 3 questions you posed are answered. I'm a little confused as to what the length of the current moratorium is, and I would concur with some of the members here who hope that you will release that moratorium as soon as it's safe to do, and that you would focus on bad actors as opposed to punishing anybody that's out there doing a good job.
If I may, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, just responding to the 2 questions. In terms of the engineering reports, the fact is that the report to the President was my report, and I appreciated the input from the engineers and many others who were involved in helping us write the report. But the decision on the moratorium essentially was my decision as Secretary of the Interior. It wasn't the decision of engineers or anybody else. So I think I've covered it.
Thank you.
Mr. Gonzalez for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. On the moratorium, I share some of the same concerns as others, and when we had the other witnesses, Mr. Secretary, I also expressed that I wasn't in total agreement with what the policies that have been instituted at this place, and I think Mr. Green probably articulated many of my own concerns. Until we find out, and I think Mr. Shattuck has a good point, until we find out what went wrong at Deepwater Horizon, how are you going to proceed with remedying that situation if we really don't know? Now, some people say it may have just been a deviation from what is accepted industry standards in, I don't know all of the terms, all of us, we're not going to be experts in this, but the casings and the cement and so on in capping the well. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that's what we find out. We find out whoever was responsible for that didn't do that particular process correctly. And according to everybody else in the industry, they would have never done it in the manner in which it was done. That's the assumption that they're making when we've had them here as witnesses. How does that play into what you're going to do with the moratorium? Because this could be an open-ended question for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. I mean, I'm not sure when we finally arrive at answers.
Let me say there are many questions, and one of them has to do with drilling safety, but there are many others that are obvious, such as the oil spill response plans and the capability. I think it is fair to say that the oil spill response plans that had been in place are inadequate. And so how we deal with that issue is something that we can start working right away. And waiting until we have the reports from the commissions and the other investigations isn't the way that we want to do business. We want to move forward as quickly as we can. With respect to blowout containment measures, which is another set of issues, what you probably have here at the Macondo well is the greatest laboratory in the history of the world relative to what you do on containment, because it has been a learning process. Many failures, but many lessons that have been learned. And so creating this kind of containment capacity in the Gulf of Mexico may be one of those outcomes that we want to latch onto and not wait around for another 6 months before we start developing that kind of an effort. So I think for those of you who are concerned about the moratorium and its length, you should be supportive of the kind of effort that we're undertaking to try to move forward to create the goal of safety and protection for the environment with respect to oil and gas drilling.
And I think we all share the same goals. We just believe, one, on expediency, of course, being thorough, and the fact that you can treat different wells that are in different phases or stages of development differently, so that there's not so much catch-up when you finally lift it in part or in whole. Now, you had a federal district court basically enjoin you, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you issued a new moratorium that would be, obviously, have something different for the court to consider the next go-round. Is that correct?
It is a new decision with significant additional information, and we believe a very good record. We believe the first one was a very good decision as well and is legally defensible. much happened between the first decision and the second decision in terms of additional information.
So you were responsive to some of the judge's concerns?
Yes.
Thank you. I've got about a minute, but I want to give you a chance to respond to what was stated earlier by former Secretary Kempthorne. He made a general statement that in his opinion and what he read, even though he has not been privy to any meetings by any of the stakeholders or participants, that he sensed, one, this administration didn't make use of all assets that were available. Number two, that he did not see that the administration was truly engaged, that maybe there was non-engagement. And thirdly, that it didn't see the administration creating an environment which was conducive to cooperation among all of the different individuals at the local and state level. 27 seconds, if you can give me the administration's response.
Thank you, Congressman Gonzalez. Let me I have great respect for Secretary Kempthorne, but let me say that I very much disagree with those conclusions. Within days after the disaster started unfolding, I was actually in a meeting in Louisiana with Secretary Napolitano, Director Browner, and others, with Secretary Gates on the phone, authorizing the states to move forward with the National Guard. And yet very few of the states have really brought up the National Guard to the level that they could have brought it up. But that was done within days of the onset of this disaster. I will tell you, knowing and working with my colleagues on this cabinet and the White House every day, including sometimes at 11 o'clock at night, like we were last night, and sometimes at 2 in the morning, that we have not rested and we have been relentless in terms of our effort to deal with this problem. And we are confident that we are going to deal with this problem, and we're going to have some fixes here that are good for the United States of America.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, on the commission that the President put together that's currently conducting hearings, I know I testified before them last Monday along with Senator Landrieu, and one of the points we were bringing up was about the moratorium, and pretty quickly into that conversation, and this was their first day meeting, they said that they were not tasked with addressing the moratorium, and Senator Landrieu had presented some letter that you had written where you had indicated that their recommendations on the moratorium were going to be one of the factors that you did consider. So I'm trying to find out is there a gap? Were they not aware that this was a role they were supposed to play? Is that a role that they're supposed to play?
Our position, the moratorium is my decision as Secretary of Interior. We will be informed relative to the central issues of that moratorium based on the findings from multiple investigations, including...
Will that commission be part of that decision-making process when you...
We will consult with them.
So they will, in essence, be tasked, as part of their task, with addressing the moratorium, or at least making recommendations to you?
Congressman Scalise, their mission is to get to the bottom of what happened with the Macondo well and the Deepwater Horizon, and to make sure that there is no stone left unturned.
Right, but would the moratorium be part of that broad issue?
No, no, it won't. My decision and my authority as Secretary of Interior is to move forward with the OCS plan and production in the Outer Continental Shelf. And the
so they will not be making any recommendations to you on the moratorium, or you'll not be seeking recommendations from them on the moratorium?
We will be working with the Commission, and certainly with Chairman Riley and Graham. We have the greatest respect for them, and certainly we will seek out their thoughts and their ideas, and whatever information the Commission...
Okay, the reason I'm asking is this is important back home to people that are trying to figure out which way to proceed in trying to put the facts on the table and get people that are making decisions to incorporate all of the facts. And so many people went and testified before that commission with the understanding they would be addressing, or at least in some way be working with you or talking with you about moratorium decisions. And if they're not, then please say so that people aren't wasting their time back home. But if they are, then that's important to know too. But I don't see why this is an issue that's muddled.
Let me just give you where I think the best thing for your constituents and for you as well to communicate with, and that is Director Bromwich is holding hearings on these very issues, the three issues that I've outlined before in my testimony, and it would be very useful to hear the points of view of people with expertise on drilling safety, on oil blowout containment strategies, as well as...
So will Director Bromwich be advising you in any way on the moratorium as well?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Now, getting specifically to some of the details of the moratorium, the 30-day commission that you had put together right after the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon, they did come back with some safety recommendations, and then this confusion about the moratorium came about when, and I think initially you had said that they recommended the moratorium. They came back and said that's not what they said. In fact, the members of the Safety Commission, a majority of them, opposed the moratorium and laid out some, I think, important specific points about why the moratorium that you issued would decrease safety in the Gulf. And I want to ask you if you've seen their recommendations about that and what your thoughts are, because when I spoke to some of those, and these are people that you picked, scientists, engineers, experts in the field, they said four basic things. One is a 6-month pause, as it's been described. By the end of the 6 months, your most experienced, your most newest and most technologically advanced rigs will go. They'll be the first to leave and the last to return. And in some cases, it would be years because they operate on 3 to 5 year contracts. Also, the crew base, the most experienced crew members, people who've worked 10, 15, 20 years in the industry, they're not going to sit idle for 6 months while their families still have needs. They're going to go on and do something else, so you lose them. And then in the interim, if you're going to be stopping operations, there's a higher level of risk with stopping production, so that you're bringing in a factor of risk there. And the country's demand for oil hasn't reduced, so you would then, we will be importing more oil, and 70% of the spills come from importing oil on tankers. And so with those factors laid out first, have you seen those safety concerns that they expressed about your moratorium, and do you disagree with them?
Congressman Scalise, let me say that I very much appreciate the work of the engineers that gave us input on the safety recommendations that went into the 30-day report. At the end of the day, that was my report, but I understood as well that the engineers disagreed with my policy decision, not theirs, on the 30-day moratorium. I specifically asked them to come in to my office, and they did come into the Secretary of Interior's office and gave me a complete briefing on their point of view before I issued my new decision. And so their point of view was thoughtfully considered, and I look forward to working with them and with others as we move forward on the issue. I would say this for you, Congressman Scalise, because I know how you care so much about the Gulf and the oil industry there, and that is that if you look at the President's position and my position with respect to the Gulf of Mexico and drilling there, we have said that oil and gas is part of our energy portfolio. So we would ask this Congress to join with us as we move forward to address these issues relating to drilling safety, oil spill response, and blowout containment, because the sooner that we can address those issues, the easier it's going to be for us to move our hand off the pause button.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
I yield myself 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the Hill. I want you to know that we're taking good care of your brother. So you have nothing to worry about.
Thank you.
You have a very difficult job, obviously, but I believe you're the right man for the job, and I think that we're all with you in every move you make, because this is something that's nobody could have expected. I have sat through all the hearings that we've had in this committee, and one of the hearings we had the chief executives from all the other major oil companies, not BP, but Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and Shell. And it seems that we've made great progress in the methods of drilling, getting the oil out, but very little progress in a response plan and preventing a disaster. The other oil executives were all quick to say that what happened with BP wouldn't have happened with them, with their company, because they built things differently, the plans were differently. But yet, it seemed to me that everyone else had exactly the same plan for a response. So I'm wondering if you could tell us your thoughts on this. I mean, it certainly seemed that BP cut corners in order to save money. Could this happen again? And what would happen if a second major blowout occurred while Unified Command and oil spill response equipment and personnel were busy battling the Deepwater Horizon spill?
Mr. Chairman, I very much appreciate your statement, and let me just say we very much agree with you. In fact, if you take a look at the three central questions, perhaps the two that are most obvious for me today right now is the oil spill response capacity. Representations that were made with respect to skimming, for example, that really have not borne out to be true. The issue of oil blowout containment programs. We have now every day from almost the very beginning, I have a U.S. lead call with BP every morning where we go through the strategy that they are unfolding relative to the next containment program. I've watched effort after effort fail, some partially succeed, and now hopefully moving to ultimate success. So in the context of that dynamic, it has seemed to us that it would be imprudent to move forward with a lifting of the moratorium until we get some answers to those basic questions.
I couldn't agree with you more. Let me ask you this. The Associated Press recently reported that there are 27,000 abandoned wells in the Gulf of Mexico on federal leased lands. Now, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that abandoned wells sometimes leak. So what tools do we have, and what additional tools would you need to keep these abandoned wells safe?
I have asked Michael Bromwich to develop some recommendations on how you deal with these abandoned wells. In some ways, it is very reminiscent of a problem that some members of the committee are familiar with respect to abandoned mines. Once they're abandoned, no one owns them, and there's not a lot that sometimes can be done for a very long time. So I would hope that as part of our overall Gulf Coast restoration plan and dealing with oil and gas production, that is an issue that can be addressed perhaps both legislatively as well as dealing with the resource issues that would be required in order to deal with the abandoned wells.
Thank you. I'm going to yield back the balance of my time because I know the time is late and you have to go, and we have a couple of members who still need to. Yes, Mr. Sullivan, 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. And I just wanted to ask, as Secretary, did you, prior to the Deepwater Horizon incident, consider improving rules and regulations regarding MMS, inspections of offshore exploration and production operations prior to the Deepwater Horizon blowout?
Yes, Congressman Sullivan, the answer to that is yes. There were several efforts, including notice to lessees to increase the safety of drilling in the Outer Continental Shelf. There were efforts included in our budgets to increase the number of inspectors. And so it's an effort that was ongoing. In September of last year, we asked the National Academy of Engineering, an arm of the National Academy of Science, to provide recommendations to us on safety issues. We had proposed a rule, I believe, in June of 2009 that would have dealt with other issues out in the Outer Continental Shelf. So it was an ongoing effort that we had in terms of our reform program.
And, you probably heard this analogy a lot, but when we have a commercial airline tragedy, we do not stop all airline travel for like 6 months. We work to find out the root cause and making air travel safer rather than grinding the airline industry to a halt. Why are we shutting down an industry for 6 months here, particularly given companies have drilled tens of thousands of offshore wells in the Gulf over the past 60 years without a prior accident of this nature?
The answer, Congressman Sullivan, is that if we were to have another tragedy like the one that we see at the Macondo well, there's frankly insufficient resources to be able to respond to that kind of an oil spill response. In addition, we frankly yet do not know how exactly it is that we're finally going to get to killing the Macondo well, and we will not rest until we have that well killed. And so in this kind of a dynamic circumstance, as I've explained to the committee, it seems to us to have the pause button in place until we can get the answers to some very fundamental, important questions relating to safety and relating to protection of the environment.
And Mr. Secretary, on the commission that's been set up by the President to investigate the situation, it has some former governors and administrator of EPA, I guess former governor of Bob Graham, U.S. Senator Graham, former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, William Riley, Francis, and I may get his name wrong, Beinecke, is that how you say it? President of the Natural Resource Defense Council, it's a nonprofit corporation, Donald Besch, President of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Terry Garcia is Vice President for Mission Programs for the National Geographic Society, Cherry Murray as Dean of Harvard School of Engineering, and Francis, I think it's Ulmer, Chancellor of the University of Alaska. When the President put this together, why do you think, or does anyone here have experience in drilling wells and worked in the oil and gas industry at all?
I do not know the members of the commission, Congressman Sullivan, other than the two chairs and I think and maybe 2 or 3 other members of the commission. But I do know that in selecting the members, they were selected because they were the kinds of elder statesmen that would do a great job in reporting out the root cause of what happened here and making recommendations. They also have understood, they are in their staff, that they are putting in the subject matter expertise that will ultimately be needed for them to do their job. So I'm confident that at the end of the day, the mission that has been given to the commission, which is to leave no stone unturned as we find out what exactly happened with this particular blowout, that they will be able to achieve that mission.
And I think you're right. They are elder statesmen. I think they are going to do a good job in that regard. I believe there's a lot of intelligence on this committee too. But I would like to see, and it's too late now, but I don't know why they didn't include someone that's from the industry that could actually, use real life experiences to help with this. Is all I'm trying to get at, I guess.
Well, I think former EPA Administrator Bill Riley is also was on the board, maybe still is on the board of ConocoPhillips. I also understand that they have hired and are hiring additional people with subject matter expertise as staff members to the commission.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I apologize for coming in late, and I may indeed ask you a question that's already been asked, so forgive me if I do that. In my opening statement, I commented a little bit about the changing of mineral management services to, and I'm not going to try to remember what the new name is, but my concern was that in a time when we needed to have all our resources, all hands on deck, if you will, to try to stop the leak and to effect the cleanup ASAP, that here we were, you were indeed charged, maybe it was the Secretary responsibility to do that as soon as possible. But if you can tell us what exactly, what was the emergency in regard to reorganization of MMS, and what exactly have we done? I don't want to sit here and suggest to you that it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but naturally people are a little bit concerned. So my question is simply this: what did you do, and what does this do, and how does it make it more effective and more fail-safe and correct some of the existing problems that you recognized after this disaster occurred?
Thank you very much, Congressman Gingrey. Let me answer with a number of different points. First, my view has been, as I testified in September of last year before Representative Rahall's committee, that it is important that an organization like MMS have an organic statute because it has existed by executive order since 1981, and it has some critical functions, including the safe production of our oil and gas for our nation, as well as generating on average about $13 billion a year. an agency that has that kind of importance for the American people should have a legislative construct. Number two, with respect to my reorganization of the agency, what we have done is we have taken the people who are involved in the revenue collection and moved them to another unit of the department. They essentially are about 700 people who are mostly located in the Lakewood office, where we had terminated the royalty in kind program earlier this year because of the sex and drug scandals. We think there needs to be distance from the revenue collector, from those who are actually leasing out the resource of the American taxpayer. So that's one unit, if you will, the revenue collector. Then there are two other units. One unit will actually be the bureau that will actually decide how and where to lease. So they will go through the creation of the 5-year plan for the OCS, the leasing plans, the lease sales, the exploratory plans, and the issuance of the APDs. And then a third unit that essentially will be the inspection and enforcement unit, making sure that the laws, the regulations, both with respect to environment and safety, are being complied with.
Mr. Secretary, that particular unit, will that be beefed up manpower-wise?
Our proposal is to beef it up significantly. There is it's part of the supplemental legislation that is pending before Congress to begin the first chapter of beefing that up, and we hope to have a budget amendment that could increase the number of inspectors and others that are needed to work within the new agency by as many as 450 personnel. It seems, Congressman Gingrey, as I said earlier on, that it is a fool's errand, if you will, to have 4,000 production facilities in the Gulf of Mexico alone, and to only have 60 people that are assigned to go out and do the inspections. So the robustness of this agency, I think, is a necessity for us as a country to move forward with safe oil and gas production in the Outer Continental Shelf.
Mr. Secretary, I hope that we will need those 400 more and not slash even more if we continue the moratorium. So if I get that plug in to you as well, as soon as we can stop this, I think, ill-advised moratorium and hire those 450 additional people and get that drilling going again in a safe and effective manner, I think that's what we would like to see, at least on this side of the aisle, and I hope you would agree with us. And thank you so much for being here and testifying and responding to my question. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Bono-Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you again. I think last time I saw you, we were working together on a trails issue. It's good to see you. Welcome back to the Hill. As you probably know, my district is very abundant in renewable fuels. And as you probably know, I support renewable fuels. But I also support being very honest with my constituents that in order to transition our economy towards future fuels, we have to do it in a realistic way. In your words to my colleague, Congressman Latta, you said it's a mistake to start and stop energy policy. But you are doing that very thing with this moratorium, in my opinion. I think it's a mistake to do what you said we shouldn't be doing. And I understand what you're talking about, but I just want to weigh in and echo my colleague's sentiment about the moratorium being a mistake. Even though I believe in future fuels and moving us forward, we have to give certainty to people who are drilling today in the Gulf. So I want to be on the record in my displeasure with the moratorium. But that being said, I think what is really missing from the debate so far is the absolute lack of coordination between all of the agencies. I live in a district, as you know, also that sits on top of the San Andreas Fault. And every day we worry about the big one hitting us. And I think that my constituents have gotten to the point where they don't believe government is going to be there for them. And I don't believe that they think they're going to be well coordinated and provide a good response to a disaster. And I think this is a perfect example of that. Can you tell me, as we go forward with habitat restoration and all that has to be done, what you're doing to make sure the agencies under your purview, whether it's National Park Service, whether it's Fish and Wildlife, BLM, whomever it is, how are they going to be better coordinated? And more importantly, I think, to bring the state in the emergency response plans, the state is a huge leader in all of those decisions that would be in response to a disaster. But in this case, they're being ignored. And we're hearing constantly from the governors that their ideas and their suggestions are being completely ignored. Can you respond a little bit to what you would do differently, how we're going to do this going forward, and reassure my constituents that we do have our act together, because I don't think that they're going to believe that for a minute.
Sure. I appreciated your questions very much. Let me just say, first on the stop and start comment that I made it with respect to national energy policy, which I think everybody would agree has not worked through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even until
And
today.
it doesn't work today. And that's the point that I'm trying to...
That's why we need to have a comprehensive energy program moving forward, and that's why the President has been spending so much time on it. With respect to habitat restoration, just very quickly, we do believe that the Gulf Coast will be restored to a better place than it was before April 20th, and Secretary Mabus, at the direction of the President, is leading the effort. We are working very closely with him, including multiple meetings that my staff and I had with Secretary Mabus yesterday. And then thirdly, with respect to your question on coordination, what I would say is this is the most Herculean response effort to an unprecedented disaster that the United States has ever seen. And I'm on the front lines of it, working with the President, working with my colleagues in the White House, and working with all of the agencies of the United States government. And when you look at the resource that has been amassed to respond to this ongoing problem, which is now in its 90th day, it is something that when you actually realize what the numbers are and the effort are, it makes me proud of the fact that the United States government is operating in the way that it is.
Mr. Secretary, I think this is where we disagree, and I think my constituents are going to react to what you just said. You are very proud of the fact that we have a huge bureaucratic, large government response to a disaster, and we're ignoring people on the local level and the local voices and people who have ideas. You're saying you're very proud of a huge bureaucracy and a bureaucratic response to it, and I think that is the problem. We have so many bureaucrats and people out there who don't know what they're doing. And to get to my colleague Sullivan's question about the panel, the President's panel has nobody who even knows anything about drilling a well. You know, and I consider myself a warm and fuzzy Republican, and I like a lot of people who are on that panel. But I think it's short-sighted in the fact that it doesn't have people who have serious expertise in how to drill a well. It just seems that bringing expertise in the oil and gas field to that panel would have been a good thing. And just since I have 13 seconds left, you still contradicted yourself. I understand what you're saying about a national energy policy, but you cannot say, but it is okay to start and stop right now. Because that is what you're doing, is the exact same thing that you are advocating against. So I am right on the money at 0-0, and I appreciate the opportunity to question the Secretary. Thank you.
If I may, Chairman Markey, just respond to the Congresswoman. First, with respect to this effort and reaching out to the local communities and to the governors, every day, my colleague Valerie Jarrett and a number of other people from the White House are on a telephone call where the governors participate. Some days they don't. The President himself has made personal outreach to them. I have done the same thing. I have been to the Gulf Coast and to Houston. I think the last count was 10 or 11 times. My Assistant Secretary Tom Strickland 17 times.
But then how does that explain that there are still booms sitting unused in warehouses, and that there are boats sitting unused and skimmers sitting unused? You can say you can reach out to somebody, but it is not being deployed.
I'd be happy to get you a copy of the daily report which we received, but this is a huge mobilization of an effort to deal with a very tragic and a very unprecedented disaster. And the President has said, leave no stone unturned, do not rest, and get the job done, and that's what we're committed to do.
We thank the gentlelady. Tell you what we can do. I was intending on concluding the hearing right now, but I can recognize the gentleman from Texas for 2 minutes.
I thank the Chairman for the recognition. Secretary Salazar, when President Obama came and spoke to the country about the problems in the Gulf, he said that he had expanded offshore drilling, quote, under the assurance that it would be absolutely safe, close quote. Now, the concept of being absolutely safe, apparently there was a team that advised the President, Carol Browner, yourself, and Secretary Chu, So is that factual? Is there a team that advised the president on the fact that offshore drilling could be assured was absolutely safe, and were you part of that group?
Our view, Congressman Burgess, is that we had and still have a thoughtful plan in terms of moving forward. The Gulf of Mexico was a place where thousands of wells had been drilled. We felt that there was a place in the eastern part of that would still keep you 125 miles from Florida, where there was 67% of the resource that could be recovered.
So you and Carol Browner and Dr. Chu did advise the president that this was absolutely safe?
Let me just say, what I did as Secretary of the Interior is I developed this plan, and I developed the plan over a very long period of time that included multiple hearings from New Jersey to Louisiana to California to Alaska, and hundreds of thousands of comments. So it was my plan and my recommendation that I made to the president.
So in retrospect now, would you say that you made a mistake, that was wrong?
I would say that the plan that we put forward was in fact a very thoughtful plan. We canceled 5 leases, huge lease sales in Alaska, for example, because we felt that the oil spill response capability and the science was insufficient.
But in light of what's happened, were you in fact wrong at that assessment?
I think the plan that we put forward at the end of March was a plan which took a year to develop with huge input from all of the stakeholders, and which I believe is still a good plan.
Okay. The gentleman's time has expired again. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, we know that you went above and beyond to be here this afternoon. It's greatly appreciated by this committee. We have a jurisdiction over energy production generally in the United States of America, hence our title as the Energy and Commerce Committee. Your service to our country is greatly appreciated, and we thank you for being here today. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.